to the precipice at spring. I was 12 years old, little for my age, and excited to prove myself on the large canoe trip. As the headmaster loved to remark, character development at St. John's was all about perseverance and fortitude, and the ultimate test was meant to be this journey to the far north. We planned to spend weeks paddling along historic fur trade routes, culminating at Musini, the point where the land and Hudson Bay meet. Late that evening, with headlights shining through the drizzle, my parents dropped me off outside the school gym. While their parents muttered their final words, 26 lads stood in queue with their equipment, attempting to look brave. I recall Dad's hand on me and Mom's tight, shaky embrace. "Make us proud, son," I said over my shoulder. The bus doors clanged shut after that. The fragrance of wet wool and wax canvas filled the air as we rode shoulder to shoulder through the darkness. Nobody got much sleep. Both the uneasy exhilaration and the road's roughness kept us awake. The leaders took a seat close to the front. Mr. Bird, the tall, sharp-eyed veteran, Mr. Kane, steady but quiet, sunburnt and robust, Mr. Denny, and the new man, Mr. Thompson, a young English teacher who appeared to be more of a bookworm than an outdoor enthusiast. He grasped his thermos as if he wasn't sure what he had signed up for, yet he laughed effortlessly. By daybreak, the bus came to a halt near the edge of Lake Timiskaming, a huge, seemingly endless expanse of slate grey. The pines along the shore stood motionless and black, while mist hung over the surface. The 4 large canoes, each modified to accommodate 6 or 7 of us, were unloaded. Their hulls were scuffed from previous journeys, and they appeared to be massive, robust, wide-bellied wooden animals painted red and green. Cold sandwiches were had while standing for breakfast. Our breath was visible in the cold air. The life jackets arrived next. They were cumbersome, heavy, and had a subtle mildew odor. Mr. Bird said, "These will keep you afloat," as he moved up the queue. "As long as you keep your wits about you," he said with a tight, self-assured smile that gave you the impression that nothing could go wrong. We pushed away from the coast at about 8. "Stick together, boys," he said, his voice resonating across the lake. "Paddle steady, and we'll make good time." Mr. Denny was steering from the stern of the second canoe, which I was in with my bunkmate Tom and 4 other people. In time, the paddles dipped. The universe felt vast and tidy, and clunk. The waves glistened in the dawnlight. The water appeared friendly and lively. It was all bravado and laughs at first. Over his shoulder, Tom smiled at me. He said, "I bet I can outlast you." I shot back, "No chance. You'll be the first to give up." Our voices echoed across the water as we splashed and joked. Mr. Denny grinned as well. Mr. Thompson's boat lagged slightly behind us, his strokes erratic. He let out a shout. A happy, "All right, back there." Mr. Bird dismissed it with a wave. "You'll get the hang of it," he shouted. We had travelled miles by noon. There was nothing but boundless wildness and the soft roar of wind off the hills. No boats, no houses, no human habitation. We made a lunch halt on a peninsula. Once more, cold sandwiches. No one dared to complain, even though my shoulders ached and my hands throbbed from holding the paddle. Complaining was a sign of weakness at St. John's. The atmosphere changed when we launched once more. Clouds were hanging low over the tops of the trees as the sky darkened to gloom. Mr. Bird gestured forward. "Boys, stay in formation. Here, the lake gets wider. The wind quickly picks up." He was correct. The water became agitated in an hour. The canoes were battered by waves that sprayed chilly mist on our faces. My gut knotted as I attempted to laugh it off. Tom gave me a quick look. "Getting rough," he whispered. "Yeah," I replied, trying to smile. "We're fine." However, the wind was howling by 2 o'clock, white-capped and raging. The waves rose like undulating hills. Following behind, Mr. Thompson's canoe started to retreat. We heard him yelling something, but his words were cut off by the wind. Then his canoe disappeared into a swell in the blink of an eye. "Jesus!" exclaimed someone. Mr. Denny turned our canoe. "They've fallen." Paddle vigorously. With our blades stinging the turbulent water, we dug in. However, A wave struck us hard in the broadside before we could get to them. Water poured over the gunwales as the canoe rocked. "Bail it out," Mr. Denny shouted. We utilized everything, including our hands and caps. This time, another wave crashed higher. The world turned upside down. The icy shock felt like a knife. My lungs seized as I gasped. Everything was dragged down by the ruthless, black water. Coughing, I clung to the overturned boat as I kicked to the surface. Boys screamed all around me. Tom bobbed up close by, his lips already blue and his eyes bright. "I can't feel my legs," he exclaimed. I yelled, "Hold on," and grabbed him. "Just hold on." Mr. Denny was already there, yelling commands and drawing one child in close. "Link up, link up." The waves repeatedly broke over us as we clung to each other and formed a chain. I slipped on the wetwood with numb fingers. I watched as Mr. Bird's boat turned around, but all attempts at rescue were unsuccessful. Every cargo caused their boat to capsize. "Swim for it," Mr. Bird said. "Head to shore." However, the shore was a grey line, protected by cliffs, kilometers away. The minutes seemed to go on forever. The boys grew weaker one by one. 10 years old David began to ramble incoherently. "Mom," he said icily, his gaze far away. Denny tried to keep him afloat, calling him Mr. Red, but the youngster fell limp and slipped under the waves. My own arms hardly functioned as I yelled. Jerry, another child, lost his hold and floated off, yelling till the lake engulfed him. I was torn apart by the sound of it. An animal's panic. We struggled to remain united, holding upon Mr. Bird's overturned canoe. The pace of progress was excruciatingly sluggish. The chill tore at our bones. To keep awake, I bit my tongue and tasted blood. I'm not sure how long it had been before we finally arrived at the cliffs. Maybe an hour. Mr. Denny remained still. Mr. Bird looked up after checking him, his voice lifeless. "He's no longer there." Refusing to abandon him, we carried his body with us. There were 18 of us who reached the rocks. Our skin was rough and pallid as we crawled up, trembling violently. Tom's teeth chattered as he leaned into me. "Thought we were done," he muttered. "Me too," I replied, trembling but calm. Mr. Bird lit a fire by striking a match from a waterproof tin. "God will see us through," he muttered. His expression was drawn, with distant eyes. David, Jerry, and Paul were the other 3 boys we hauled out of the water. Their lips blue, their eyes open but blind. We attempted chest compressions as instructed, but it was ineffective. Mr. Kane put our extra jackets over them. "They're with the Lord now," he said. We didn't get any sleep. Throughout the long, chilly night, we cuddled close and listened to the lake hiss against the rocks. I flinched at every sound, half expecting another wave to come from the shadows and pull us back. Mr. Thompson sat aside, trembling and muttering. "I ought not to have guided. I ought not to have." Mr. Bird simply gazed into the flames. He added, "We all made mistakes." A helicopter emerged through the mist at first light, a red speck that increased until the sound of its blades pounding the air could be heard. We were led away from the corpses by rescuers, who descended and covered us with blankets. Mr. Denny and 12 boys had vanished. Over the course of the following few days, their remains were discovered strewn down the coast like unfulfilled promises. It was referred to be a terrible accident by the school, said that nobody could have foreseen the storm. However, we were aware they had gone too far, and we knew it. Disregarded the cautions. Trusted custom over common sense. I hardly mentioned it to Tom again. Even now, though, there are moments when I wake up gasping and hear the sound of waves lapping on me, the shout drowned out by wind. The moment Tom's fingers moved away from mine, they weren't only taken by that water. That day, it took something from each of us, something that was lost forever. From each of us, something that was lost forever. Our final portage, the smooth resistance of the paddle, the whisper of cedar and spruce, the low call of a loon resonating across calm water, and the silent pull of the boundary waters were all things I had always cherished. Since we were young children, my brother Ben and I had been coming here, following our father's boat until our own arms were powerful enough to pull us across the lakes. This time, we had brought Frank, David, and Chris, our old buddies. We were just average folks back home. Ben and I were construction workers. Chris was a plumber. David was there to assist. Frank also sold anything that needed to be sold. Titles, however, were irrelevant out here. It was only the two of us, the canoes, and a wide expanse of wildness that made you feel both small and alive. We paddled hard to our first camp on Nina Moose Lake, ever veering off the Echo track. That night, the sky glowed gold. We laughed about past adventures and larger fish. We sat around the fire and exchanged stories. We suggested that the big wally would be waiting for us someplace up on Crooked Lake tomorrow. Morning arrived quickly and chilly. The canoes were loaded, Chris and David in one, Ben and me in the other. Frank remained at the camp to mind the equipment. The scent of damp rock and pine sap permeated the air. With our muscles throbbing from the strain, we portaged around Curtain Falls and slipped into the pool above it. With the exception of a slight shimmer where the river began to flow towards the edge, the water was perfectly motionless and as flat as glass. We dispersed and began casting. The only sounds that interrupted the peaceful stillness were the distant rush of falling water and the sound of reels. "Nice one, Alex." When I brought in a fat walleye with shimmering scales, Ben called, "Your turn to top it, little brother," I added with a smile. As the current started to move in the direction of the falls, Chris and David floated closer. It didn't seem risky at first. The water swirled slowly around their canoe until the bow swung to the side. I yelled, "Hey, you're getting close." With a little smile, David looked up. "We're doing well." They weren't, but they were adjusting. They were in the water. The river tugged more forcefully as the bow swung once again. The sound of Chris's voice broke through the atmosphere. "Paddle back vigorously. It's too late." The canoe flipped after rocking once and twice. As it slipped towards the edge of the falls, I watched it neatly flip over and then stand back up. David's face was contorted in fear as his arms clutched to the sides. After that, he vanished. For a brief moment, Chris emerged, standing chest deep on a submerged rock with water swirling around him. "Help," he shouted. Ben and I locked eyes. "We have to go," he declared. Before I could respond, he was paddling directly in the direction of the pole. We were quickly hit by the current. Every blow seemed like pushing against a wall of liquid muscle. We battled it. "Grab on, Chris." I leaned forward and yelled. Haddle reached out to him. His hand missed by inches as he lunged. We were all taken by the river. The canoe broke like a matchstick. It struck the rock broadside. The world burst into sound and white water. I was dragged, squashed, whirled, and submerged. Rocks were slammed into my ribs. My head struck a hard object. Gasping, I surfaced once before plunging back down. Every part of my body was flooded with cold. I saw Ben's arm reaching, Chris's face contorting in the current, and then nothing but the noise amid the bursts of green light beneath the surface. It was beneath the falls when I finally came to the surface. Along the Canadian coast, the ocean had vomited me out onto the more tranquil eddy. Pain shouted from my hips. I had lost my sneakers. I called their names into the mist as I crawled up the bank, breathing like fire. David, Chris, and Ben. The water was the only one that responded, unending and uncaring. I cut my feet on rocks and thorns as I staggered barefoot along the shore. The silence of the forest took the place of the sound of the falls behind me. Maybe 15 minutes went by before I noticed a flare of color across the lake, the stern of a canoe trapped in reeds on a small island, and then a voice. "Over here." David was the one. "I'm coming," I yelled. However, there was a 50-foot raging current between us that was too deep and too rapid to swim. I trembled as I tried to decide whether or not to take a chance. At that moment, I noticed another canoe emerging from the fog upstream. A lone paddler arrived out of nowhere. I found out later that his name was Nick. He was traveling alone with a friend. He called, "You okay?" "No," I uttered in a broken voice. My pals crossed the waterfall. On that island, two are missing and one is injured. Nick's expression stiffened. "Let's get you in." As I crawled onto the canoe with my leg in excruciating pain, he steadied it. We battled the current together to reach the island. David was there, his leg bent at an unimaginable angle, pallid and trembling. "Broke it bad," he whispered. Ben and Chris. They were not visible to me. Nick and his friend quickly constructed up a tarp shelter and retrieved a satellite communicator. Sense of distress, he said. They will arrive. The wait was excruciating. With each breath, David moaned. The lake turned to glass as the light dimmed and the temperature dropped. I sat next to him, listening for anything as I looked across the pitch-black water towards the falls. He said, "Think they're out there." I answered, "They must be," but the truth was pressing in on me from the bottom of my heart. The wilderness doesn't always return the favor. After several hours, a jet flew overhead, its light blinking once, twice, and then disappearing. Barely gasping, we gazed up. "They're looking," I muttered. The helicopter arrived around midnight. As it descended over the island and whipped the trees sideways, the sound grew from a quiet hum to a shattering boom. She subsequently told us that Grace, the pilot, leapt out with composure and accuracy. She started by checking David. "You're in rough shape," she remarked. "We're getting you out." His face was pale in the floodlight as they hauled him away. He yelled out, "See you soon, Alex," and vanished into the dark sky. Until the next flight, a savior accompanied me. The roar of the falls reverberated through the night as we sat silently next to the dwindling fire. He said, "They're searching," but his eyes told me what his words couldn't. When I was eventually taken out, the wilderness vanished beneath the helicopter. Under the moon, miles of dark forest and sparkling lakes. Medics in Ellery hurried me to an ambulance, and then to Dooth, severe cuts, bruised ribs, and pelvic fractures. I was still alive because I was in pain. Ben and Chris had never left camp safely, but Frank had. It was a 17-day search. Dogs, boats, divers, and drones. The entire grid repeatedly combed behind the Curtain Falls. The water there is untamed, seemingly alive as it twists over boulders and whirlpools. They discovered Chris on the 13th day. Ben was pinned by the current 2 days later and was too deep to come to the surface. I felt like I was going under again when they informed me. The sound of the falls roared in my ears, filling my lungs with water. Services were held at home. Ben's, Chris's, and our families were all standing there looking as surprised as if we were still trying to wake up from a dream. We were unable to stop. People talked about their lives, but all I could think about was how they fought the current together until the very end. I still hear that sound when I wake up at night. The moment everything changed, the never-ending stream of falling water. We believed we were familiar with the outdoors. We believed that respect was sufficient. However, it has its own set of rules. When someone reaches too far or makes a mistake, it takes what it wants. Chris and Ben were the best among us, and occasionally I swear I can hear them when I'm out there by myself in a canoe on a Racon morning. Our words echoed over the glistening lake before disappearing into the trees. Glistening lake before disappearing into the trees. The trapline, I had to leave the city behind. The continual buzz, the traffic, and the noise prevented me from thinking clearly. I didn't think twice about going up north when my two closest friends, Tom and Lisa, recommended it. A canoe trip through Minnesota's border waters, a vast network of lakes and forests where you may paddle 4 days without hearing another human voice, was something we had been discussing for months. Tom had made a few brief excursions there before, and he spoke of it as if it were holy land. I could see Lisa was anxious even though she was thrilled. She had never been that far out before. For me, it was about the silence, the sort that feels like it's encroaching on you from all sides and serves as a reminder of how tiny you actually are. With a tiny camp stove, food, sleeping bags, tents, and an old aluminium boat mounted on top, we departed before daybreak. The majority of the day was spent traveling north. Trees grew closer to the highway until the towns vanished and the sky was only reflected by lakes. At last, we arrived at the entrance, which was a tiny gravel area next to a quiet, crystalline lake. The air was vibrant, chilly, and clean. I felt a rush of satisfaction when I pulled the paddle for the first time. Tom steered from the stern, sturdy, self-assured, each stroke intentional. Lisa sat in the center, her paddle faltering at first before settling into a rhythm with mine. Tom grinned and remarked, "This is going to be perfect." Lisa squinted at the sun and grinned. "As long as we don't flip over, sure." It was a simple first day. We were surrounded by open ocean, a soft breeze, the scent of pine, and damp dirt. We giggled when Lisa nearly slid in the mud during one of our portages, which involved pulling the canoe over a short rootless route to the next lake. By late afternoon, we discovered a campsite on a small island with a blackened fire ring from spent coals and a rocky beach with just enough level ground for a tent. As the sun fell low, Lisa and I worked silently gathering wood while Tom made the fire. As soon as the flames ignited, their reflection danced on the water like a second fire that was blazing underneath the surface. We watched twilight settle while eating dehydrated meals. The smooth sea was filled with the sorrowful calls of the loons, and nobody said anything for a time. Lisa muttered, "It feels like we're the last people in the world." In the firelight, Tom grinned. "That's kind of the point." I heard a sound when I woke up later that night. Howls rolling across the lakes in the distance. Wolves. The sound was primordial, lonely, and unsettling. Beside me, Lisa stirred. "You hear that?" "Yeah," I muttered. "Half sleeping," Tom muttered. "They are far away. Return to your sleep." However, I was unable to. Long after the night was silent once more, I couldn't get the calls out of my head. Mist hung like breath across the ocean the following morning. After setting up camp, we paddled farther into the maze, past towering cliffs covered with moss and through small passageways, surrounded by cedar and birch. The pathways became slippery and cluttered with roots, and the portages became harsher. Leading the way, Tom shouted cautions over his shoulder. "Keep an eye on your footing. These rocks are lethal." Laughing, Lisa wiped away the swarm of insects surrounding her. Why was I not warned about these creatures? We were in a long, winding chain of lakes by midday. When the sun cleared the haze, there was a complete sense of solitude. Just the sound of paddles dipping in the silent sigh of water. No planes, no far-off boats. I became aware of something along the shore at that point. A piece of ripped blue fabric caught on a branch. Then there was another, aged, faded piece farther down. "Hey," I pointed. "You see that?" Tom looked over. "It's probably just outdated equipment. It's common for people to lose things out here." Lisa scowled. "It appears intentional, as if someone was rushing." After that, I couldn't get rid of the impression that the woods were too motionless, as if they were holding their breath, even if we didn't think about it. Tom stretched the canoe and said he was going to check out a game trail that climbed uphill while we paused for lunch on a thin strip of rock. "I'll be back." After unpacking our meals, Lisa and I divided the map. "How far is it to the next location?" she inquired. I answered, "Maybe 3 hours if we keep pace. We'll arrive before nightfall." Minutes went by, then 10. There was no trace of Tom. "I phoned you, Tom." "Nothing." Lisa got up. "Where are you, Tom?" A second later, there was a scream, unmistakably his, rough and sharp. We let go of everything and started running. As we followed the sound, the undergrowth ripped at our legs. When we discovered him, he was lying on the ground with one leg entangled in a rusting metal trap and his face contorted in agony. His footwear was drenched with blood that was collecting in the ground. He cried out, "Get it off," as he scratched at the steel jaws. Shaking, Lisa knelt next to him. "Oh my gosh, God." Tom remained motionless. The old trap was partially concealed by leaves. The chain was fastened to a stake that was buried deep in the ground. Although it appeared to have been neglected for many years, it functioned well. "Who the hell leaves this out here?" I murmured as I felt for the release, my hands shaking. Every time Tom exhaled, he grunted in pain. His breathing was labored. I discovered a lever concealed in the soil and used all of my effort to press down. With a metallic snap, the jaws were released after creaking. Tom let out a scream when his leg sprang loose. It was a serious wound. Bone gleamed through ripped skin, deep and jagged. With blood-slick hands, Lisa did her best to wrap it. "We have to get him out," she declared. I swallowed hard and nodded. At this point, We dragged and partly carried him back to the canoe. He felt his weight heavier with each stride. The air was then split by a crack. A shot was fired. Bark splintered as the bullet struck a tree trunk just inches from Lisa's head. Down, I pushed her behind the canoe and yelled. There was another shot. This one hissed sharply as it hit the water. Lisa let out a cry. Who is firing at us? I'm not sure. Simply move. Tom laid flat in the bottom of the canoe, moaning. As we pushed off the coast, the canoe swaying dangerously. The water surrounding us was hit by bullets, creating sprays. As I paddled, my arms burned and my muscles screamed. With tears running down her cheeks, Lisa pulled hard, while remaining low. We were unable to determine the source of the rounds as they followed us, reverberating through the forests and rebounding off the rocks. Then there was nothing but the ragged sound of breathing and the slap of paddles. We arrived at the next portage after what seemed like an eternity. Tom was unable to walk. Leave me, he clenched his teeth and muttered. No chance, I informed him. Stumbling down the rocky trail, Lisa and I carried him between us. His leg was bleeding through the bandage, and his face was pallid. I heard footsteps keeping pace and limbs snapping in the trees next to us halfway through. I froze. Have you heard that? I muttered. With wide eyes, Lisa nodded. Remain going, she muttered. We almost threw the canoe into the water and didn't stop until we got to the next lake. As we paddled, I sensed that people were watching us and that something was always moving in the shadows. When we eventually saw the road, a gravel access point, and our car waiting like a lifesaver, the sun was setting. Tom was barely conscious when we pulled him out, wrapped his leg tighter, and drove off. I was able to send out a signal long enough for the rangers to receive it. Tom barely made it through. Weeks of recovery and surgery. The trap was discovered by the rangers, but no one was in the area. There were only old metal and deserted woods. No camps, no tools, and no footsteps. They speculated that it might have been an old poacher's trap or a lonely person who didn't want companionship. We never returned. I still occasionally hear that sound, the piercing snap of metal reverberating someplace beyond the trees, late at night when everything else is silent, and I wonder if the person who was out there that day is still anticipating the arrival of the next canoe on that desolate stretch of water. The journey started with the electric pulse of adventure that turned strangers into brothers. According to The Edge, I had just returned from I was eager to explore the uncharted territory of college when Art asked me to accompany him on his journey down the Dubant River, a far-off northern route that few people ever see. There were 6 of us, all of us young and eager for the kind of adventure that challenges one's character. From Black Lake to Baker Lake, our journey would follow the historic Terrell Trail through tundra and stillness, following the footsteps of long-gone explorers. Our leader was Art, a contemplative man with the peaceful concentration of a person who genuinely understood the universe. He talked about documenting the North before it vanishes, and his camera was always within reach. Sun-brown and wiry, Peter could navigate a canoe through white water while keeping his eyes closed. George, who was older than the others, complained about everything, even our pauses and pace. However, when it came time to deal with rapids or move equipment, he was the first to move forward. As novices, Bruce and Joe were eager but inexperienced. Their paddles were awkward at first but quickly stabilized. I was more helpful with a compass and a topographic map than I had anticipated, and I was in the middle of being a learner and an explorer. We packed the necessities of living on the land into our kayaks. One clear morning in late June, we set off from the rocky beach of Black Lake carrying grain, sugar, tea, tents, weapons, film reels, and the burden of our own aspirations. Clouds mirrored flawlessly on the glass-like surface of the ocean. As we simultaneously dipped our paddles, the call of loons reverberated through the silence. There was a world ahead that was untouched by highways, signage, or sounds, only the sky and untamed water. The initial weeks were jam-packed with activity and exploration. Dragging our canoes over mud-filled portages and black fly clouds, We traverse the vast expanse of Holder Lake. They will devour you if you don't keep moving. One night, while we were swatting at our necks around the campfire, Peter laughed. Every night, the sky seemed closer and the countryside seemed bigger. With caribou herds grazing in the distance, Art would set up his tripod and record the long light flowing across the tundra. With awe in his voice, he repeated, "This is what Terrell saw. We are strolling through history. Those early days seem to go on forever." We told stories that blurred the boundaries between reality and fiction, baked bannock over the fire, and watched the sun set and then rise again. But the lines started to blur even between friends. George frequently complained that we were moving too slowly, and that we were wasting too much time filming. Making a movie is not our goal. One evening, he gazed into the fire and stated, "We're here to get through." Art simply grinned and gave a quiet response. "Why not both? The movie represents our trip." I nodded, but I was still torn between wanting to move and wanting to stay. The land had transformed by the end of July. The sky grew wider, the trees grew thinner, and the winds off Debant Lake intensified. The weather became more erratic and the water became colder. We were confined to the shore by days of gales, while the waves continued to pound. Every meal became a calculation as our resources ran low. The tundra was silent, but Art promised that we would hunt more. There are few games and no pathways. We limited the amount of flour, and each spoonful of lard is smaller than the previous, and they are stirred into a thick porridge. Optimism started to give way to perseverance when we constructed a stone automobile and left a message for whoever might follow. The rapids, swift, untamed, and perilous, arrived in August. The river screamed, twisted, and narrowed. Carrying equipment around the toughest sets, we scouted on foot whenever possible. But patience ran out as the days grew shorter and frost began to appear. George said, "We're running out of time," in a quiet voice next to the fire. "Winter will ensure that we don't make Baker Lake at all, if we don't make it soon." Joe gave a sad nod. "The cold's already here." I experienced that as well, the way our fingers stiffened on the paddles, the way the morning frost surrounded our tents, the faint feeling that the land was getting closer. Then September arrived, and the genuine character of the North became apparent. The storm struck abruptly, violently, and ruthlessly on the 9th. Our tents were flattened, and the pole was broken in two by the screaming winds that swept across the tundra. With water running down our backs, we hid under upturned canoes and shouted to each other above the wind. "Hold on, boys," Art screamed. "It'll pass." But 4 hours, it didn't. Everything was drenched when it eventually subsided. Food, clothing, sleeping bags, and film were all bulky and chilly. With shaking hands, we started fires, the smoke dense and urgent. Black and swollen, the river waited for us, but we continued since the stop would be to die. Everything broke on the 14th. Art chose to investigate the rapids from the canoes, even though they appeared to be dangerous close to Marjorie Lake. Now, time was against us. His voice was muffled by the roar as he called, "Stay close, watch for rocks." The water foamed white all around us as we sank under the surge. Peter's canoe then hit a concealed ledge ahead. He and George vanished in an instant as it reared and tipped. "Thrown into the flood, man overboard," Joe yelled. With our hearts pounding, we paddled hard, but we were also caught by the current. The water crashed in like ice knives as our boat smashed broadside. I submerged myself. My breath was taken away by the shock of it. Every nerve was scorched by the cold. Gasping, I scrambled to the surface and grabbed the overturned canoe. Next, Art's boat overturned, packs and cans of film scattered downstream, forgotten memories. There was mayhem in the river. Rocks slammed against our shins as the current pulled us through the shower. "Swim for shore," Art screamed, but the cacophony drowned out his voice. Peter and George managed to find a boulder and clung to it. Joe and Bruce battled their way to the shallows. The air was so chilly that it was difficult for me to breathe when I crawled up to a gravel bar. Art was still in the water, his strokes diminishing, and his lips blowing. We shouted his name as we dragged him inside, while we waited outside. His skin was as pale as bone, and he was trembling fiercely. He said, "I'm all right," but his words were slurred. We undressed him, massaged his limbs, and covered him with the remaining dry clothing. "Stay with us, Art," Peter pleaded. But as the hours went by, his breath slowed until there were none left, and his eyes wandered aimlessly. The ensuing calm was more oppressive than any storm. With the tundra wind screaming over us, we buried him as best we could under a cairn of stones and an overturned canoe. We were silent for a considerable amount of time. All we could feel was the pain of loss and the harsh reality that we had to carry on. There were still 2 canoes that floated despite being fixed and partially leaking. So, hungry, empty, and haunted, we continued. The terrain was unending and uncaring. Frost seeped more into our tents every night. Ptarmigan and the rare hare were the few things we managed to hunt. When that didn't work, we likened and cooked morse to fill the void in our bellies. Our hands were split and raw, and our cheeks were emaciated. I occasionally saw caribou figures moving in the mist when I was on the verge of tiredness, but they disappeared when I blinked. In the breeze, voices murmured, or perhaps the river was making fun of us. We were half ghosts by the time we wandered into Baker Lake. Until the shaking ceased, the people brought us in, covered us in warmth, and served us broth. We had succeeded, but at a price that none of us could quantify. In the icy, unrelenting water, Art's dream came to an end. However, I never forgot his vision. The notion that the North is merely endured rather than conquered. I returned home feeling different, more subdued, and burdened by what we had witnessed and lost. I can still hear the debate, its roar, its hush, its brutal and wonderful truth, even now when I close my eyes.